Good morning, Sales Academy family, followers, TikTokers, YouTubers, podcasters, listeners, and everything in between us. Thank you for being followers and contributors. So today's musing is one of pleasure versus happiness. And this is a personal thing as well as a shared thing that's come up in discussions. But it's the difference between, and it's like in conversations, I've asked this question of others, as well as asking it of myself, which is why I wanted to come on and do this podcast musing. So the difference between pleasure and happiness, and studying a little bit of the psychology of this and kind of digging in a little bit deeper, not just my own personal feelings, but listening to very, very clever people talk about this subject and just condensing it down a little bit. So here's my take on it, and I'd love to understand whether this resonates with you, whether it challenges you, whether you disagree, agree, whatever. Come and have a chat, right? So the difference between pleasure and happiness is pleasure has always been short-lived bursts. Pleasure seeking, choosing behaviors or choosing activities, choosing situations, choosing people and stuff, and I'm seeking that pleasure, which is like a hit. Whereas happiness for me is always been much more peaceful. When I look at where I'm happiest, there's always one of the key driving elements to that is peace, whether that's inner peace, that comfort of the people that you're with the situations you're in, wherever you might be. That for me, so wherever I am, whoever I'm with, whatever I'm doing, if there's a huge amount of peace within that and I feel that peace, then that feels like happiness for me. That's my version of happiness. That's the fuel that goes into it for me. Whereas pleasure, and this takes me back to bad behaviors, bad choices, and all that sort of stuff. So pleasure is always hits of enjoyment, hits of pleasure. So it becomes a bit addictive. It becomes a bit like a drug, seeking that pleasure stuff. And that's where like you might be doing some things, or I was doing some things that wasn't congruent with living a good life, and I was making choices that were affecting myself and other people. And the fact that we were getting that pleasure hit meant the stuff that was happening underneath and the stuff that wasn't being talked about, that should have been being talked about, it was enough to mask it, or whatever you want to call it. And it's like suddenly you get to a point where chasing that pleasure hit, it becomes less about any of that stuff, and it becomes more about the dopamine release that you get with the pleasure hit. So each time you get that pleasure experience, that short burst of your brain, your chemicals release in your brain, and that's dopamine. And that is a high, right? Dopamine is a happy high, but it's not a sustained, peaceful happiness. It's a hit. So that becomes like a drug. That becomes the addiction. So dopamine itself and the release of dopamine becomes the drug and the addiction itself. So the habits and the behaviors and the choices and the things that you're doing to get that dopamine hit, that's where it becomes reckless, because you almost don't care, because you're going after the dopamine hit. You're craving that dopamine hit. Now, this isn't excusing in any way, shape, or form shitty behavior from me, from anyone, right? But it's understanding that there's a chemical release of dopamine that your body craves, and the more it has those little hits, the more it wants those little hits. So the cycle of addiction of dopamine hits is what actually drives you to do more of that stuff. And it just becomes, but it's never fulfilling, it's never lasting. And in fact, when you get that dopamine high, you crash, and then when you come back up to a steady level, it's potentially lower than you were before you got the dope. So then it's never enough, and never enough, and never enough. And it's a cycle of destructive pattern, destructive behavior. So that short-term pleasure is not what we seek. So my question for you, because I've described my version of happiness, which is so very much driven by peace. But I understand what that means to me, and I'm not projecting this onto you to go, well, that's what yours has to be or whatever. But understand what pleasure is for you and what happiness is for you, the difference between the two. Take a look, hold the mirror up to yourself, right? And hold the mirror up to your behaviors, your choices, and go, okay, well, which ones are those short-lived dopamine hits that actually some of the choices and behaviors, they might be affecting other people, but I'm allowing that to override it because the dopamine hit is strong enough, it's good enough for me or for my individuals or for the people around. So we're excusing it because actually the dopamine's right. Whereas happiness and true happiness and that peace and that belonging is so important and so powerful in its own stillness, in its own silence, and its own kind of solace. Is there is no urgency with it. There's no running at 100 miles an hour with it. There's finding that happiness in tiny little things, like waking up in the morning and opening your eyes and your lungs still work, and being grateful for that. Not just fucking saying it, but properly realizing that every single day and allowing that to be your fuel. You don't have to get up. You haven't got to get up. You get to get up. You get to wake up. That's a gift. Right? There's happiness right there. You've got milk in the fridge. You've got food in the fridge. You can make yourself some lunch and a cup of tea and stuff. And you can sit in the sunshine. It's November and it's sunny. We're up a frigging mountain with 45 blokes yesterday, and it's like 17 degrees. And it was beautiful in the Brecon Beacons. And the conversations were amazing. And the connections were brilliant. And the laughter. And we also we honored the 2-minute silence for Remembrance Day and stuff up on a mountain after the last post. And it was emotional. There was passion, there was humor, there was support, men supporting each other, men. I had one bloke coming up behind me, literally running behind me, pushing me up the hill at one point. And we were laughing and joking. I was like, mate, if you can keep doing this. And it's like, so there was happiness to be found all the way round over 9.5 miles of grueling walk up hills and mountains. Beautiful scenery and gorgeous, misty, cold morning, followed by beautiful blue skies and stunning brown bracken and beautiful greens and ponies on the hills and stuff like that. And meeting other hikers and just chatting away and making deeper connections with the people. There's happiness right there in abundance. So yeah, what's the difference between pleasure and happiness for you? Where's it showing up? Where's it manifesting? What are some of the habits and behaviors? Which ones are you choosing that you know are getting that dopamine hit, but they're not serving you and they're not serving the people around you? And it takes courage to step away from that stuff because it is like a drug. It is like an addiction. But as I say with everything, right? It starts with awareness. Awareness leads to choice. Awareness of how you're thinking, feeling about that stuff. Awareness of the outcomes, decisions, the knock-on effect, the ripples. And then that leads you to choice, right? We've all got a chance to choose to be better. No matter what our past is, we've always got the chance to choose to be better. And I challenge you to put you first in that context. Have a brilliant week, guys. That's it. That's the musing. Pleasure versus happiness. See you later.